Hi, my name is Stacy Julius, and I'm the president of the Mounted Archery Association of the Americas. Today, we are going to talk about arrows. So we get a lot of questions, especially from new members, about what kind of arrows should I buy. And we decided to make an entry-level video just covering the basics. Now, with any sport and equipment, you can get really technical and get way off in the weeds. And this video is just meant to be the basics to get a beginner started. That way they're buying the right type of arrows. That being said, the kind of arrows that you get really do need to match your bow. So unless you have a bowyer in your area or somebody that's knowledgeable about tuning arrows to bows, the information that we're going to give you here will at least get you by to get you started. We're going to talk about the types of arrows, what they're made out of, the lengths, the tips, the nocks, and we'll go over fletches, and we'll go over some safety tips as well. So there are different kinds of materials that arrows are made out of. The one that is probably used the most for mounted archers is carbon. This is a composite, what they call composite or carbon type arrow, and the reason these are really popular and are great for beginners is they're more durable. They're going to take a beating, and with our sport, especially when you're starting out, you're often missing the target, you're hitting the stand, you're hitting the ground, you're hitting other arrows, you're hitting rocks. So these will stand up better. There are also aluminum arrows. I started out with aluminum arrows, but they are the softest type of arrow and they're not going to hold up. I found that my aluminum arrows, I bought them originally because they were lighter and they were cheaper, but they were bending and breaking more frequently. So not really a great type of arrow to get. The other one is your bamboo and your wood arrows. You can have wood arrows that are made out of pine, that are made out of cedar. The bamboo arrows are going to have little joints in them that you can see here. The wooden and the bamboo arrows are a little bit softer. They'll break a little easier, though there are certain types of bamboo arrows that you can get that are just about as durable as your carbon arrows. It's really going to be your personal preference. It's going to be up to you what you want to shoot with. Some prefer the wooden and the bamboo, and some want to go with carbon. As far as the carbon goes, you'll notice that there is a number. Hopefully you can see that. There's a number here. Like this says 700. This one here is a 600. The higher this number, the more flexible the spine is going to be. And you can get them, 200, 300, 400, up to 1,000, even more than 1,000. For a beginner, start with about a 500 to a 600. That's middle of the road on the stiffness or the flexibility of the arrow. I like to shoot with 700s. I know people shoot with 1,000s, 1,200s. It's going to be personal preference. The more time you spend in the sport, you're going to refine your equipment along the way. But again, your basic carbon arrow, 500 to 600, it's going to be a little stiffer, a little more durable, a little less easy to break than, let's say, a 700 or more, but it's also going to be your personal preference. There are also differences in the diameter of the shaft. Like this, for instance, is a nano. It's really super thin. This is a 600 as far as the flexibility goes, so middle of the road. And then you can have arrows like this wooden arrow is super thick. You can even have carbon arrows that are this thick. It's really going to be your personal preference and how the arrows work with the type of bow and the way that you shoot as well. As far as the tips go, there are different kinds of tips that are quote-unquote legal in mounted archery. This is probably your most common tip. This one's a little bent on the end because it's been used a lot and has probably hit a lot of different things. These arrows tips are just your basic target tip. And then you can have a target tip that looks like this. And a lot of archers will use the field tips, or what we call a combo field tip. If you can see these, they're all very similar in their shape. Very, very slight differences. I prefer to shoot with this type of a tip here, but whatever you can get at the archery stores by you, as long as you're not using an aggressive tip like a hunting tip, you'll meet the specifications for the rules for mounted archery. Another question that we get a lot is, should I cut my arrows? Now, when you buy arrows, they're going to be about 31 inches or 33 inches, depending on the arrow. And the theory is that if you don't cut them, the longer the arrow, the more stable it is in flight, so it should fly better. The thing about mounted archery is a lot of times we're pulling from a quiver, and like me, I've got a shorter torso and shorter arms. It's hard for me to get a full-length arrow out of my quiver. You know, I usually have 2 to 3 extra inches of arrow that I don't need, so I do recommend cutting your arrows. You can go to any archery shop. You'll need to bring your bow with you. They're gonna measure your draw length, which is how far back do you draw your bow, and then they're gonna measure your arrows so that when you're at full draw, only about 1 inch or 2 is sticking out past the handle, the front part of your bow. You don't want to shoot with arrows that are shorter than that because you can overdraw your bow. And yeah, like I said, about 1 inch to 2 inches is pretty standard if you want to have those cut. The other thing is your nocks. Now, if you've done archery before, you're probably used to nocks that look like this. Pretty standard nock that you get on the end of your arrow, and those are totally fine. Here's another type that's been bent out a little bit. Totally fine for starting out. A lot of mounted archers will actually take pliers and they'll bend the ends out a little bit just so that it makes it easier, especially for loading quicker, and if you're up to doing blind knocking, it just makes it easier to feel where you are. If you want to get more sophisticated, you can get into various other types of nocks, like we have fang nocks and vermal nocks. There's Y nocks, there's U nocks, there's gator nocks. There's all kinds of different nocks, and if you notice, these are different because they have a wider edge, so it makes it easier for them to pop on your string. You will have to experiment because the insides of these are usually a little bit wider, so they won't click on your string. But if you can load quick, it's usually not a problem, or you can actually get a string that has more strings within it so that it's thicker, or get a thicker serving on your string so that it will clip in if you do like them to clip in. There's different things that you can do. Personally, you know, I like these options here because it makes them faster to load, especially when you're competing. The biggest thing I could say is if you've got a chapter near you, just go ahead and ask to shoot other types of arrows, other types of nocks, so that you can get a feel. It's really going to be up to your dexterity and what you feel more comfortable with. Some people love like a fang nock, and some people just absolutely don't like them. So again, it's going to be personal preference. The other thing I'll back up and say is about the tips. You'll notice when you go to the store, you're going to find tips that have different grains, different weights to them. And the heavier the tip is, the more it's going to pull your arrow around. So it really depends on the flexibility of your arrow, the length of your arrow, the weight, and the diameter of your arrow as to how heavy of a tip you're going to get. But generally, you can't go wrong with about 100 to 125 grain tip. That's pretty standard. Like I said, I'm not going to get into all the technical part. It does get super confusing, and I don't know about you, like when I first started the sport, I started Googling information, and I wanted to really know and understand. I knew that the bows were different, so I wanted to understand how the arrows were different, and the more I read, the more confused I got. There's lots of technical stuff, and if you don't realize, like the aluminum arrows have a different numbering system, so that gets confusing. And there's a lot of different theories out there, So just be careful with your research. Don't get too deep into the weeds. Just start out with something basic. You really can't go wrong by just getting a box of carbon arrows, especially if you can get them on sale. They usually sell like 6 in a box. They already have Fletches on them. They have Nocks. You can bend them out if you want. You would just have to go and buy your tips. And again, if you're getting a 500 to a 600 carbon arrow, that's middle of the road in the flexibility or that stiffness, about 100 to 120 grain tip should do fine. As far as your fletches go, you've got plastic vanes, and these are examples of plastic vanes and different lengths of those. It's fine to use these. Some people do, and that's totally fine. It's going to be your preference. These are a little rougher, especially on your hand. Especially if you're not wearing a glove, they're gonna cut you more than a feather fletch would. And a lot of the mounted archers do use feathers, and you can do 4-inch feathers. This is a 4-inch. This is a 5-inch. You can do 3-inch. And then some people say, well, I notice, you know, you shoot with 3 feathers, and I notice that some other people have 2 feathers, and some people have 4, you know, feathers or fletches on there. And does it make a difference? Really, for our sport, it doesn't, because of the type of shooting we do. We're not doing super long distances, and you know, our targets are pretty close. It's really not going to matter. It's going to be preference for you. And again, you can have like 3, 4, or 5-inch feathers. You can have different shapes of the feathers. Like this is a shield cut. These rounded edges are parabolic. They have Ozark. They have ones that have notches in them. They have all different kinds of designs and colors. So, you know, you can personalize those and make them for what you like. The other type of arrow we're going to talk about is the flu-flu. You may have heard of flu-flus and wondered, what the heck is a flu-flu? These are all examples of flu-flus. And if you notice, they have big feathers on there. These are actually designed for hunting birds, and they have more drag with the feathers, so they don't shoot as far. We use this type of arrow for our quabak courses, and if you're not familiar with a quabak, it's a 16-inch cymbal that's on the top of a pole. It's about 27 feet up in the air, and we shoot up at it. So naturally, we don't want any sharp tips. So you use a blunt tip, and these are examples of 2 different kinds of blunt tips. There are some other ones. This arrow here that I bought, actually the tips came attached. These arrows I bought from Shields and Cabela's, and they don't come with tips, but you can buy a box of tips, so you just screw those in. One of the things I will say is when you're shooting your arrows, make sure that all of the types of tips that you have, that you check once you're done shooting that they're screwed in all the way, because they do like to you know, back up and loosen up, and they're not going to be as effective, especially these sharps. If they're like this, I don't know if you can see that, and they're not in all the way. You can hear it when you shoot, because it'll make that little tingy kind of a noise, but when it hits the arrow, it may not stick and it may bounce out. So always check to make sure your tips are tight. One of the tricks that you can do is take bowstring wax, and just go ahead, the grooves on the end here, just get some wax, and you can see there's a little bit of wax left on this one, and screw it in, and that will deter it from backing out as easily. Usually you only have to do that, you know, every couple of months or so, depending on how much you're shooting. The other thing that I will say is safety, is making sure that you're checking your arrows frequently. This is something that indoor shooters or ground archery shooters, you know, that's not a habit that they do. But in our sport, we're shooting outside, we're hitting the stand, we're hitting other arrows, we're hitting rocks, we're hitting trees, we're hitting, you know, other things, and we could damage our arrows. So you want to visually inspect your arrows, because you don't want to be shooting with an arrow that has any gouges or cracks or breaks, because if that happens, when you're at full draw, let's say I had a little chunk missing here and I didn't know it, when I go, just before I go and I'm getting ready to shoot, this front part of the arrow is going to fly, but the back part is going to most likely go through my hand or through my thumb. If you Google archery accidents, almost all the pictures you're going to see on there is through the hand and through the thumb type pictures. So you want to visually inspect for any kind of missing pieces, chunks, splits. You want to feel with your hand, but be careful because you don't want to get any shards. And then your last test is to bend the arrow and listen for any cracking or like sandpaper kind of a sound. And you want to turn your arrow, just turn it and flex it, turn and flex and turn and flex. So you're going to do it pretty quick like this. That way you can flex out each side of the arrow and you're listening for any kind of cracking. Sometimes you don't see it, but when you do that test, you can hear it. And that has actually been something that has saved me on a couple of occasions where I visually inspected. My arrows looked great, but then when I went like this, lo and behold, there was a little crack in there. And so you don't want to use those arrows because they're not going to be safe. If you have questions or you've got more, you want more information than just like this basic, definitely reach out to me, or if you have somebody in your area that you can talk to. It gets super technical. There's a lot of science behind it as to how your arrows will fly, but for just beginners starting out, just recommend a carbon arrow that's, like I said, about a 500 to 600 shaft. Make sure you get either a target point or a field point, or what they call combo field point, about 100 to 125 grain tip. Again, you don't have to go with the fancy Nocks right away. You can use the Nocks that come with your arrow. You can just bend them out a little bit if you so choose. You don't have to if you don't want to, but that's a great starting point. And if you have any questions, just contact us.